In Sanity and the Metaphysics of Responsibility, Susan Wolf takes a more practical approach to the problem of moral responsibility than most other philosophers. There are three main parts of Wolf's essay. In the first, she examines three accounts of moral responsibility. In the second part, she builds on those accounts by proposing an additional condition for moral responsibility. And in the final part, Wolf considers objections to her account and acknowledges that she has not eliminated every metaphysical issue related to the problem of moral responsibility. Wolf begins her essay by comparing discussions of moral responsibility by average people versus by philosophers. In normal contexts, people tend to think they understand the general conditions for moral responsibility. These general conditions include age, awareness of one's actions, and so on. Rather than question what the conditions of moral responsibility are, most people focus on trying to apply the conditions to particular cases. Was my teenage kid responsible for the car accident, for example? Philosophers, by contrast, have tended to focus on the conditions of moral responsibility. Philosophers have been much less concerned with applying the conditions of moral responsibility to particular cases. Wolf's strategy in the essay is to harness the discussions of moral responsibility within everyday contexts in order to inform the philosophic discussion. Wolf thinks that the philosophic discussion of moral responsibility has missed a very important condition that can be found in the everyday discussions. But first, Wolf summarizes three different philosophers' accounts of moral responsibility. The three accounts are by Harry Frankfurt, Gary Watson, and Charles Taylor. Common to all three accounts, Wolf argues, is the assertion of a deep or true self. Within Frankfurt's account, the deep self corresponds to his concept of second-order volitions. A second-order volition implies that we have a stake in which of our first-order desires motivate us. In one of his examples, the unwilling addict will feel frustration if he succumbs to the first-order addiction. Similarly, Gary Watson distinguishes between a person's values and a person's mere desires. Something like starting a family or pursuing a career would reflect a person's values, while preferring one flavor of ice cream over another would be merely a desire. Finally, with Charles Taylor, the deep self or true self is the product of revision. We have thought about and revised an aspect of our identity rather than just accidentally possessing the identity. At a more general level, all three accounts imply that responsible agency is more than acting intentionally. To act with intention only implies that you were aware of what you were doing, but this is not sufficient to guarantee that a person is morally responsible for the action. For instance, someone who has been coerced into committing a crime, perhaps a villainous person, has threatened harming his or her family. Thus, the person intentionally committed the crime, but only because of the coercion. The villain would be responsible for the crime, not the person who was coerced. From Wolf's general perspective, we would say that the crime is not connected to the coerced person's deep self. The deep self view has a number of positive features. Asserting the existence of a deep or true self seems to broadly correspond to people's intuitions about the nature of personhood. We commonly talk about someone acting out of character or not feeling like our normal selves. Another advantage is responding to deterministic worries about moral responsibility. If there is a deep self, then it's possible to argue that determinism only concerns superficial aspects of oneself. For example, my taste for ice cream may have been determined by external causes, but my ethical values are, by contrast, a function of my deep self. Yet Wolf thinks this response only pushes the problem back one step. The question then becomes, what governs the deep self? Is the deep self simply the result of a chain of external causes? If so, an individual would have no metaphysical control over the deep self. Everything would be governed completely by the causal order of the universe. Susan Wolf thinks this problem for the deep self view is partly addressed by turning to everyday discussions of moral responsibility. The deep self view, Wolf argues, is missing an important condition of moral responsibility. In the middle part of her essay, Wolf considers some examples to illustrate the need for this missing condition. Wolf's most important example concerns an evil dictator named JoJo. JoJo was the son of another evil dictator, Joe. So, kind of like Dr. Evil and his mini-me. JoJo followed his father around from a very young age. JoJo watched his father commit horrible crimes, torturing innocent people. It's unsurprising that JoJo subsequently grew up to become a cruel dictator himself. JoJo satisfies all of Frankfurt's standards for moral responsibility. JoJo is aware of his cruel actions, he knows that he's torturing people, and furthermore, JoJo has a second-order volition to torture people. This is what he wants to be doing. This is how he thinks of himself. Yet Wolf thinks that JoJo is not morally responsible. This is because JoJo is insane. His father's upbringing radically distorted how JoJo views other people and the world more generally. Given such an upbringing, Wolf doubts whether anyone could grow up to be a sane person. The condition missing from Frankfurt's account is sanity. This is a glaring omission given that sanity has long been recognized as an essential condition in legal cases. An insane person will not, in general, be held criminally liable for their actions. Instead, if it is a dangerous situation, the insane person may be institutionalized. Formulating a precise standard of sanity is very difficult. Wolf refers to one of the oldest standards, the Amnaten Rule, which was created in mid-1800s Great Britain. The ALI test is a more recent standard that has been used in the American legal system. Even if it is difficult to settle on how best to define sanity, Wolf thinks it's clear that it is an essential condition for moral responsibility. Her more general proposal is to add the condition of sanity to the condition of possessing a deep self. Together, these two conditions, Wolf argues, are sufficient for attributing moral responsibility to a person. Wolf then applies the sanity condition to some morally appalling societies. Similar to the case of JoJo, growing up privileged within a slaveholding society would drastically skew what a person thought was morally acceptable. Likewise, it would be morally harmful to grow up as a non-Jewish German within Nazi Germany, or to grow up as a male within an intensely chauvinistic social order. Susan Wolf is not arguing that people in these societies are completely excused from any moral responsibility. Instead, the point is that it should be factored into our evaluation of those people. It can reduce the amount of responsibility attributed to a person. Ultimately, the details in each individual case would matter. If the slaveholder or Nazi was in as extreme a situation as JoJo, then they would not be morally responsible but instead insane. Notice that this does not imply that people like JoJo should be able to continue doing what they want to do. For someone insane in a manner like this, they should be confined to a mental care facility, perhaps for the rest of their life, if it is impossible to cure them of the insanity. But most people are unavoidably sane. Here Wolf points out that sanity is not something directly under a person's control. Just as JoJo did not choose to have his absurdly horrific childhood, normal people do not voluntarily choose to become sane people. Instead, this naturally follows from having negotiated the typical kinds of relationships and problems that a person deals with in becoming an adult. To build on the last point, Wolf thinks there's an important difference between moral responsibility and metaphysical responsibility. Sanity is precisely the sort of thing that is determined by external causes that people have little to no control over. The lack of metaphysical responsibility narrows the abilities of morally responsible agents. Moral responsibility must involve less than total self-creation, for we have just seen that we cannot create whether we are sane or not. Yet moral responsibility implies more than simply revising oneself. Someone who is insane like JoJo might be fully capable of revising his or her personality, but still wholly incapable of morally judging his own character. As an intermediate between self-creation and self-revision, Wolf proposes that we must have the ability to self-correct. Self-correction involves both of the two basic conditions of moral responsibility. We must be able to accurately evaluate ourselves. This requires being sane. And we must also be able to transform ourselves based on that evaluation. This entails the creation of a deep self. This completes Wolf's account of moral responsibility. In the final part of our essay, Wolf considers two objections to her sane deep self view of moral responsibility. The two objections come from roughly opposite directions. The first objection questions how that we know we are sane. Might we be overconfident in our sanity? After all, being insane prevents one from making a correct judgment. The best evidence of sanity, Wolf responds, is having successful social relationships, and to hold common values with those other people. If our moral judgments roughly align with many other people, then we probably aren't like JoJo. This isn't a guarantee. As the examples of morally flawed societies suggested earlier, it's possible for very large groups of people to be morally impaired, and these blind spots might not be revealed for some time. As one potential example of a current moral blind spot, it's possible that in the future, eating meat might be generally regarded as morally wrong. For many people, this probably seems laughable, but there are common attitudes of disbelief towards past issues like male chauvinism and slaveholding. And to be clear, I personally eat meat, so I would also be one of the masses who would be suffering from a societal blind spot. Nonetheless, Wolf thinks that widespread social agreement is still the strongest foundation for judging moral responsibility. The second objection goes in the opposite direction. Does Wolf's account count far too many people as insane? Specifically, does the sane deep self view imply that every morally wrong action indicates that the person is insane, like JoJo? In response to this concern, Wolf distinguishes between having an ability and exercising an ability. A person might have the ability to morally judge his or her actions, but, perhaps through laziness, fails to do so. In such a case, the person would be morally responsible. Wolf acknowledges that this brings up the issue of determinism. If we live in a completely deterministic universe, then there would be no meaningful difference between having an ability and exercising the ability. The causal chain of events leading up to the present will determine whether or not we have the ability. There's no role for choice. Consider the forking path model of the future. From the left, we see the past chain of causes that leads up to the present, where multiple branches appear. If determinism is true, there is only one physically possible future path. Thus, there's only one future path connected to the past chain of events. We might not be certain which path will occur, so there are multiple branches close to the actual chain of events. Applied to the present context, the behavior of individuals like Garfield are ultimately determined. They were determined to be lazy. This is why the sane deep self view fails to address all the metaphysical issues surrounding moral responsibility. But Wolf claims two general improvements. First, the issue of determinism is more narrow. We don't have to consider cases like JoJo, who are insane. Instead, our focus turns to more normal cases of human behavior. We need to determine whether there is a meaningful difference between having an ability and exercising the ability. Second, the sane deep self view reflects a renewed focus on the practical problems of moral responsibility. Our reflections on whether a teenage son or good friend are morally responsible shed light, Wolf thinks, on the philosophic theory of moral responsibility. The practical relevance of Wolf's account is thus more apparent.